Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our next session, talking railroads and Native Americans in the Great Basin. I'm Andrew Curley. I'll be what is my position here? Chair of this panel. So I'll just be doing some logistics. The idea of this panel is we have four presenters, and they're all going to have individual presentations, and some of them will go longer, some of them will go shorter than others. And what they expressed, they wanted more audience participation. So while they're talking, start thinking about your questions. They really want to hear from you, and they want to get some feedback and some questions. So go ahead and be really active participants for this session. So our first panelist is somebody that I just had the pleasure of meeting a second ago, and both he and I drove in here. So we have a lot of miles under our feet getting to this presentation. It's Principal Man Ian Zabarte from the Western Bands of the Shoshone Nations of Indians, and he's going to give you a presentation about, I think it's about nuclear waste and some of the trials of his nation in challenging some toxic and contamination. So without further ado, Principal Man Ian Zabarte.
Thank you. Making sure it's on. Is this thing on? Great. Thank you for having me. I'm also here with Principal Man Joe Kennedy. He's the former chairman of the Timbisha Shoshone tribe in Death Valley at Furnace Creek, and a representative to our Western Shoshone National Council under Chief Raymond Yowell. And on behalf of Chief Raymond Yowell, who we'll see tomorrow, I also send his greetings to you. So I can talk for hours on nuclear issues because that's been the focus of my life since I returned home to the reservation in 1984 and found my family dying from radiation exposure from fallout from U.S. nuclear weapons testing. And I focused my anger and frustration on addressing the problem. So I've been involved with these nuclear issues since that time, and we'll jump right into it. Quickly, I wanted to show you the yellow is the linguistic boundaries of the Uto Aztecan, the people, Numic-speaking Shoshonean area, including Aztec and Comanche. Comanche are Shoshone, for those of you who don't know about it. The error in this slide is Nuasogabi, which is actually the entire lands of all the Shoshone, Western, Eastern Shoshone, Goshute. And I made this map, the one on the left, which is available at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada Test Site Oral History Project website. And the map on the right is a portion of the Dottie map, which was the map in 1863 that was taken back to Washington, D.C. To accompany the treaties. And I don't know if I can do it here, but at the very bottom into the Mojave, it says unexplored. That kind of relates to the fact that the United States in 1863 did not know where they were or what was there. And our people, as I said earlier, I brought Joe Kennedy from Timbisha Shoshone at Death Valley. And we have a healing center further south of that at Tacopa. And it's important to say that I am water. Water is important to us. Water is our identity. And even along the railroad across the Great Basin, that water is our identity, and as well as the land. So there's 115 reactors in 75 locations in 30 states. And each of those communities has benefited from the construction, the technology, the electricity, the investments, the dividends, and they've borne the risk for those communities. Every step in the nuclear chain releases CO2. Thousands of workers strip mining and processing uranium. Thousands of workers building these reactors. Even the core of the reactor is fissioning radioactive carbon-14. You got krypton-85, krypton-84, cobalt-60. So many things are coming out of these reactors, and I'm not going to go in any more detail into that. But the United States designated Yucca Mountain within Western Shoshone Treaty Territory as the sole site to be investigated in 1987, and have spent to date about $15 billion. Just to give a sense of what that is, that's $1 million times 15,000, and they don't own the site. And that's what we did in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board panel. So each of those waste streams would become a river when they approach the Shoshone country, and we would be expected to bear the burden of risk from every shipment, from every site, over the period, and forbidding accidents, there's no quality assurance that they can remove the waste, put it back on a rail or a truck safely without killing people, destroying the land. I'm not going to go into too much detail. So there's the Yucca Mountain site, and if you see at the bottom center, it's on the map, but there's nothing built there. There's a 4.5-mile tunnel, and we intervened in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board to stop the project. And though it looks dry, there's Yucca Mountain in the sun with the 3 cinder cone volcanoes in the foreground. There's actually, I think, 7 cinder cone volcanoes. There's 27 fault lines, and they do things like name them Ghost Dance Fault, which is the major fault within the Yucca Mountain. We have legends and stories that I'd like to tell you about of the mountain, but I think the most important thing is I learned about climate change here at Yucca Mountain in 1995 because of the upwelling of the water every 15,000 years or so, which correlates well with the Earth's oscillation away and towards the sun, but I won't go further into that detail. Important to note that the whole mountain is saturated in the pores of the rock with water. Saturated in the pores of the rock. That's pure water. It's going to come out someday. So the other important relationships here are the Skull Valley Ghost Chute, monitored retrievable storage, which with Margie and Bull Creek, we, in our nuclear risk management for Native communities, we were able to stop. And also now is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing of the Holtec Interim Storage Partner site in Andrews, Texas. So what we're dealing with is the nuclear waste would be shipped from reactors to the Texas site, anticipating Yucca Mountain licensing by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And we see that as environmental racism because the Department of Energy doesn't own the Yucca Mountain site. And their intent is to inflict conditions upon the Western Shoshone to bring about our destruction from nuclear weapons testing, from plutonium shipped from weapons testing secretly. These things are done in secret. And I'll get to the point as it was brought up. Then the point being that there's crimes going on. So these are the rail routes from the main line that would be to the proposed repository. And I intervened in the Department of Transportation, Surface Transportation Board in 2008, June, and had them set aside their, the Department of Energy's request for a certificate of necessity and convenience for their rail alignment. But there's other rail alignments there, and it's important to also understand that of all the 75 reactor locations, that only about 70% have heavy haul roads or rail. Others would have to be barged. They'd have to build the rail lines or barge it from those sites or build those heavy haul roads in order to not overburden the infrastructure. So there's a lot to be done, and they're still pushing this project. So what we did in the 90s, because of the weapons testing, the United States detonated 928 weapons of mass destruction within our territory in secret. And that fallout went everywhere, and a lot of people from Utah here suffered as well. There are near downwinders and far downwinders, and our people will continue to bear the burden of risk that from those weapons tests that the United States hasn't helped us to address. We need surveillance, monitoring, and we need to follow individuals. Origin is important, and they moved 2 million people into Las Vegas in the past 30 years, and they're just masking the risks, the health consequences that we're suffering from, and we're not getting help from the United States. We need that. So what we focused on was dose. We did a reevaluation of the Department of Energy's off-site radiation exposure review profile and created the rabbit model because our people were eating a lot of rabbit, deer, antelope. We brought researchers from Clark University to our country. We did hunting, fishing, gathering, showed them took them to our ceremonies. And they saw that, you know, because we use dead wood, because the green wood is our staple food, the pinyon, the pine nut, we only use the dead wood. But when our people found a canyon of dead trees, they gathered it up and brought it home and used that, and that's an exposure pathway because it's potentially dead from radiation, as well as our animals. We didn't know about the fallout. My mother and aunts and uncles played in it, and that's when I came home and I saw my cousins were dying and everyone's suffering. I don't want to get into that too much either. So we've diet, shelter, and mobility. What we ate, how much we ate the whole animal, including the thyroid. And we looked at radioactive iodine-131. Shelter, where our houses were, what they're made of. Mobility, where we went, what we did there. Ceremonies, gathering, medicines, and how we use those things. And we reevaluated the Department of Energy's offsite radiation exposure review profile using the rabbit model and found a significant increase in dose. And so that's what dose came out to. We intervened in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is all of this detail here, and our primary contention was ownership of land, ownership of water, and then our NEPA contention, disproportionate burden of risk. We made these comments in the 90s, late 90s to the Environmental Protection Agency. The Department of Energy adopted their radiation protection standards without investigating our health. It's just a silence, and it's that silence that we hear from the United States, which is systemic racism. That is the structured racism, and it emanates from the culture of secrecy of these coordinate agencies. So in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board, even with the Bureau of Land Management's master title plats, which are the land status record of the United States government, the Department of Energy could not prove ownership to the Yucca Mountain site, even though Congress passed a law designating that as the site. And they spent $15 billion. We stopped that. So there is no repository, but the goal is to get it to our property, property being a thing, a relationship between people with regard to things and not the thing. The treaty is the relationship that we have. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see down there, it's 63.121, ownership, the requirement that the Department of Energy prove ownership. And so what we're trying to do is push the United States in every instance to prove ownership. Now, what's important about this in reference to railroads is that it includes the 2.4 million acres of checkerboard railroad land across Western Shoshone Treaty Territory. Title II remains unextinguished. All of the federal claim property within Western Shoshone Treaty Territory from the previous maps, unextinguished Indian title. We were just waiting for the Murphy and McGirt case. So we were trying to negotiate with the United States. We need a treaty reservation. We need a safe place to live. We don't have land except we have it all, and we assert full foreign sovereign immunity. We issue passports. We travel abroad, and Mr. Kennedy and I think between us, we've been to 12 different countries abroad. The United States says this is invalid, but they don't make laws for other countries. And all I tell people is this is made in the USA. 200 countries should be accepting our Indian passports. We don't seek to diminish our foreign sovereign personality by becoming a subject of U.S. domestic policy under Title 25 of the United States Code. That's why in the opening slide, I used the Consolidated Treaty Series reference, Volume 127, 1863, which has all the Shoshone treaties, because that is on par with every other treaty in the world and not the statutes at large, which is used to diminish our sovereignty. The biggest threat we face is sovereign acquiescence. If you're not using your own identity, then you're acquiescing to the U.S. identity. Using state driver's license and all of these things, you know, you're losing. But that's what this slide is about. The Department of Energy cannot prove ownership. Now this is what they did. This is written down. This is the report. Genocide became a crime in the United States in 1988 after the U.S. adopted the Proxmire Act, which is the UN enactments of the UN Convention, U.S. enactments of the UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And I apologize that I'm talking so fast, but I'm just trying to get through this so the others can talk. This is what happened. This emanates from the culture of secrecy, and it is that culture of secrecy, the silence, which is the intent to commit genocide, because you will not know what you're dying from when it's done in secret. And this is our burden right now, and we're trying to get a safe place to live. We need the president to act, to create the treaty reservation, to offset all of the, right now as we see it, occupiers, trespassers within Western Shoshone treaty territory. And we see them as trespassers that we want to, our culture is sharing. We want them to become legitimate. We need a safe place to live. We need to be protected so we can grow and develop as every other American does. We need equal protection under the law, and it starts with the United States president acting, and we hope that other scholars and the railroads would support this, because we want the change for all of us, for the better, for this nation. Thank you. Here's my address.
I'm a little vertically challenged, so I got to bring that down. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Is it showing up on the screen right? Perfect, all right. Not used to not being able to see my own PowerPoint, so this is a new experience. I'm Dr. Christopher MacMahon. I'm the director of the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the correlation and interaction between the Northern Paiute, or how they refer to themselves as the Numa, in northwestern Nevada, and their interaction with the Central Pacific Railroad. Now, the Numa had lived on this land time immemorial, primarily around Walker and Pyramid Lakes. I'm going to be talking about the Pyramid Lake Band today, and following me, Justin's going to be talking more about the Walker Lake Band. And it's important to remember that even though they covered the entirety of the northwestern Great Basin, we're tied to the restriction of water and aridity in this area. So even though their hunting and subsistence practices covered the area, they considered these areas where there was water in abundance that they could support life their true homeland, where they dedicated themselves to. And of course, this continues to be the case today. This is still their homeland. This is still where they live. This is still where they call home. And some of the issues I'm going to talk about in my presentation continue to reverberate to this day because it is their ongoing home. One of the areas that they primarily focused on for their subsistence was the use of the cutthroat trout. And for those of you that don't know about the Lecompton cutthroat trout, it's one of the largest trout species. It can grow up to 4 or 5 feet in length, and you can get fish that weigh in at about 45 to 50 pounds. So one fish can really support a large number of people. And this had been part of their livelihood for a long time. And like many other people in the Great Basin, they also used the piñon nuts as their primary food source during the autumn and winter months. So they had this kind of dual subsistence nature that followed the seasonal variations with the fish and with the piñon pine. And this was the way everything was until the settlers began to arrive. And shortly thereafter came the railroad. So the story I want to talk to you today begins with the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. When Congress considered the passage of this act, the idea of an iron road spanning the nation seemed logically sound, but financially uncertain. You have to remember in 1862, the Civil War is raging, and there's not a lot of money to spend for things like a national railroad when your focus is on winning the war. What lawmakers realized at this early stage, though, was that they had a commodity that could be used to incentivize the construction of the railroad: land. At least in the view of those in Congress, the United States, on paper, held title to all this land. As you've seen from several of the presenters that have preceded me today, this, of course, isn't necessarily true. A lot of the land remained uncontested. A lot of the land was never ceded by the individuals who had resided there for millennia. Despite this, that was how the Congress proceeded. And even though there were several amendments that followed the original act, the land grant process created in 1862 remained largely unchanged. Railroads would be allowed to claim any unceded land as right-of-way for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and then be given box segments on either side that they could further use to sell and recuperate costs of construction. These would be distributed in 5 alternate sections per mile on each side of the railroad, with a limit of 10 miles on each side. Why is this important? Well, to understand how this gets us to the Paiute, you need to understand the geography of northern Nevada. If you are going to build a railroad, you want to follow the route of least resistance. And for the Central Pacific, this meant coming over Donner Summit, which was one of the lower passes, following the Truckee River down into Nevada, into the area that is currently Reno, and then following the Truckee River through the Truckee River Canyon before heading out over the desert to connect with the Humboldt River. You want to follow water sources because steam engines need water. Well, the Paiute in 1858 had a reservation established through executive action by President Buchanan at Pyramid Lake. And this reservation extended down into the Truckee River Canyon. So if you're the Central Pacific Railroad, you now have a problem. You have to obtain right through the reservation to build your railroad. Now, for railroad executives, they looked at this as a very minor problem. What they thought was equitable was the guarantee that all people from the Paiute tribe could ride the train at no cost to them to whatever location they wanted, and that the Paiute could ship any goods they wanted along the railroad for free. The railroad executives thought they were getting away with a bargain. They're not having to actually pay any remuneration, and in their minds, what are these Indians going to do with free rides and free shipment? Well, they were in for a surprise. Because what happened was a big silver boom across Nevada. In Virginia City, in Eureka, Aurora, other mining camps throughout the state attracted a lot of the individuals from California as well as individuals from the East into a mining economy. Those new settlements needed food to survive. Lo and behold, there's this great fishery that exists at Pyramid Lake. Remember those big trout I was talking about? The Paiute figured out very quickly they could ship these fish along the railway for free and sell them at market at 100% profit. The Indian agents for the reservation encouraged this because it is acculturating the Paiute into the American commercial economy. And so this was encouraged and done by the Paiute. Central Pacific, not so happy. At the same time, the Paiute also realized that if they can take the train anywhere and stop anywhere, their hunting and gathering range has now been greatly increased, which they do. Unlike some of the other previous presentations where say, well, we'll slow down the train and you can get off, the agreement they had with the Central Pacific was wherever they want to go and get off, they would stop the train so they could get on or off. And so again, Central Pacific not so happy with this. And what winds up happening is that in the 1870s, the Central Pacific finally gets fed up and says, well, you know, we're not going to go along with this anymore. we don't think that we have to honor our agreement with you because this reservation that we're going through was set aside by executive action. It wasn't done by Congress. Therefore, the reservation itself is illegal. And they took this matter to court and lost. It's one of the few instances we have in the late 19th century where an indigenous community actually won its court case against a major corporation or an entity of the United States. Now, what are the lasting ramifications of that today? Well, by saying firmly that the reservation date in 1858 is valid and it was done legally, that only affirms the current reservation and the land holdings of the Northern Paiute. But remember, they're using this water. Nevada ultimately adopted a legal standard of prior appropriation for water rights, which says that the first to claim and use water for beneficial use has right to that water first. They have an 1858 claim. This makes them one of the first claimants on the Truckee River, which means before the city of Reno gets any water, before anyone else that comes after, the Northern Paiute have first right. And that is because of the Central Pacific and their determination to try and outdo the Paiute, ultimately backfiring and establishing this case that ultimately benefits the Paiute in the long run. Now, I said there's two bands going on here. I've discussed Pyramid Lake. I'm going to hand it over now to Justin, who's going to talk about what's going on at Walker Lake.
Hello, I'm very, very honored to be here. I'm having a great time so far. I am a teacher at the University of Arkansas. I got my PhD there. And I study Native American history. My book is really the reason I'm here. I'm not an expert on Paiutes or on railroads exactly. Mostly I'm here for the fry bread, really. But I'm an expert on this topic in my book. And the book is called "We Don't Want the Gates Closed Between Us." It's a long title: Native Networks and the Spread of the Ghost Dance. You can learn a lot more about that book rather than buying it by going to the website there. It's called NativeAmericanNetworks.com. You could buy it if you want to, but you probably don't have to. It's all there to enjoy. What I study in this book is intertribal networks of communication. How tribes who were supposedly confined on reservations in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, how they were able to maintain their mobility geographically, to move around and visit each other, and also how they were able to be mobile intellectually, how they were able to spread ideas and information to one another. And so the book, it talks about correspondence, networks of correspondence, massive correspondence networks. This is a map of nearly 3,000 individual letters across the country. Some of these are native to native letters, some are native to white letters, white to native letters. And these letters, tied people together. The reason I'm here today is because I also look at how folks in the 1870s, 1880s, how they visit each other, went off reservation, oftentimes without permission, traveled hundreds and even thousands of miles, oftentimes on the railroads. And so this map is from the book. It's a 10-year period, 1880 to 1890, and these are all the trips off reservation that I've found records of. There are undoubtedly many, many more, but these are the ones I have documented evidence for. I think I have over 1,200 here, and a quarter of those were done without permission. So these folks are in order to leave the reservation, they're supposed to ask their agents, permission to go to these places, and oftentimes they don't. And so you can see all these connections here. The bigger the line, the more visits I knew occur, and there's all sorts of different visits, of course, that aren't represented on this map because of the confines of the research. Now again, many of these were done especially those trips that go across the Rockies. Many of those are done via railroads. And so, this is not a touch screen, is it? So for Western tribes, the railroads made these trips from the Dakotas to Idaho to Utah, Nevada, across the Rockies. It made these trips, more practical. And as we've mentioned many times before, presenters, these railroads are the primary tool of American expansion into Indian territories. How do Native Americans deal with that, and how do they use these same tools to preserve and even spread their own ideas and cultures? Now today, of course, we're talking about the Great Basin, so I'd like to zoom in here some. Zoom in to Nevada largely. So, as the past few presenters have mentioned, including the great talk about Fort Hall, railroad companies needed to lay their rails through these lands. And so, I'll just give you a brief overview of different folks on reservations who had to make these negotiations, and also those who were able to get free rides in order to convince Bannocks and Shoshones, as Yvette talked about. 1878, free rides at least for 30 years. Southern Utes on the Denver-Rio Grande Railroad. This is a map of railroad lines, simplistic railroad lines. Crows had free rides on the Northern Pacific. Several tribes on the Southern Pacific Railroad, Santa Fe railroads, they rode for free at least for a time on these railroads. This is an example of one of these passes that an individual or a group of hundreds of Indians would get from their agent. Permission, in this case, to travel on a railroad. This is a Crow agent writing a pass for folks. So in the summer of 1890 alone, the railroad station in Billings, Montana, transported Indians between the Crow Reservation and Fort Hall, Fort Berthold, Fort Belknap, Nez Perce reservations, all just in that summer. So zooming down again to Nevada. Paiutes, Shoshones made an agreement with the Central Pacific, made an agreement with the Carson and Colorado. Employment was also a part of some of these agreements, and of course, the ability to ride free. Now, for the Carson and Colorado Railroad, which travels through the Walker River Reservation, the Walker River Agency, highlighted there, they agreed to carry folks free, and also, again, the stuff they could carry with them, their goods. Now, this line wasn't a passenger line. It was largely built to ship mining goods, stuff to take out of the ground. And in order to ride this line, Paiutes often rode, on top of box cars, in between the cars. Very, very dangerous way to travel. And so the CNC, the Carson, Colorado, it went all the way down to California. It's built between 1880 and 1883. This is the railroad that Walker River folks traveled to go to Pyramid Lake. It's also the line that folks who went to see Wovoka traveled. Once they got to off the Central Pacific line, they went down on this railroad. So Paiutes were worried that the railroad would lead to increased competition for their already limited resources. And this, of course, this fear came true. But once those rails were laid, Nevada Paiutes also rode the line constantly. They rode the railroad constantly, often, again, on top of the box cars. Tribes in this Intermountain West, this basin, they were especially connected by rail, more so than probably any other part of the West. Shoshones, Bannocks, Paiutes, they used the rails to visit each other across all these miles. So probably the most important reason, or at least the most common reason for taking these rail lines in the 1870s, 1880s, largely, was for dancing, was to visit each other and have dances, have gatherings. men, women, children. An 1879 report describes Shoshones and Paiutes arriving in Winnemucca, Nevada, for what they called a fandango there, on rail cars, came on horseback, of course, still on foot. 1883, the first year of the Carson, Colorado, 600 people met in Winnemucca. In September 1887, Shoshones living in East Nevada and Bannocks from Idaho headed west to visit Paiutes during the pinyon pine nut harvest. According to Nevada newspapers, the westbound train platforms were crowded for several days with natives on their way to the dance. It says that men wore their, quote, hats adorned with gaudy ribbons and feathers. Women wore, quote, white calicos and have their raven-hued tresses adorned with red, blue, green, yellow handkerchiefs. May of 1888, railroads carried crowds to another big dance at Pyramid Lake. And of course, Nevada Paiutes went west or went east. They went to Fort Hall later in 1888. Bannocks, Snake, Shoshones, Nez Perce, others had a big dance. Here's another example. This is from 1891. This is Johnson Sides, a Paiute leader, incredibly intelligent leader, organizing these big gatherings, these intertribal events. This is a testimony from Katie Frazier, who was from Pyramid Lake. She lived to be 100 years old. From an interview she gave in 1989, she said, and I'll read all of this. I guess we have time to read all of this. She said, "I just love to dance. I'd be dancing yet today if I could. Us Indians used to have lots of dances here at Pyramid Lake. A long time ago, people would come from all around and make a big camp by the Truckee River, where Wadsworth is now, and they would circle dance a whole week. People did this in the fall before they went to the mountains to pick pine nuts. They were dancing it for a good harvest. Pine nuts meant a lot to us because it was our winter food. I was little then, but I remember how the dance kept going night and day. Some dancers would go off to rest, but the dance kept going. Us children would always run and play. Sometimes we'd get into mischief. In the winter, people would come to fish along the river where it goes into the lake, and they danced then too. Later, some of us here at Pyramid Lake formed a dancing group. We danced at pageants and ceremonies, hospitals and schools, wherever we were invited. My husband was a singer. We did the antelope dance, the owl dance, the bear dance, lots of dances." So these connections, which were in many ways tied closer together, tied people closer together because of the ease of the railroads. These were important events. Now, of course, white folks in the area, white folks who were in the more populated regions of the basin, the Indian agents, the Commission of Indian Affairs, they didn't like all this mobility. They didn't like what somebody called here the gypsy life. This phrase, nomads, gypsies, this was a common term used to describe this mobility. According to the agent, the Nevada agent who was in charge of Pyramid Lake and Walker River, he said, the ability to ride these rails for free was probably a detriment. It was not positive for Paiutes. But, and also he said they were going to Reno and Wadsworth and falling in with bad classes of white people, going to to saloons and stuff. But also he said it might be positive because they're using the railroads to find work, right? They're going to towns to find work. And it made these individuals what he called self-supporting rather than dependent on the reservation resources. And so that's one reason in many parts of the West why some agents actually encouraged, this is the case in the Southwest on the Navajo agency, people being encouraged to ride the rails to find wage labor. And so Pirates did, they found economic benefits from the rails. Of course, they transported the products of their own labor, as Christopher just mentioned, pine nuts. In November of 1887, several Pirates carried 2 tons of pinyon pine nuts on to the Virginia and Truckee Railroad through Reno. Of course, for free. Now, unfortunately, opportunities for self-sufficiency diminishes with white settlers are coming. And this made, unfortunately, Paiutes more reliant on the market economy for their sustenance. And so many Paiutes became wage laborers on white-owned operations, some regularly traveling west through the Sierra Nevada on the Central Pacific to the Sacramento Valley in California. They're going west. They're working in hop fields, hop growers. This is a picture of a hop growing. Has anybody seen one of these farms, or they call it a farm, a hop farm? There's these big poles for some reason. I don't know what's going on here. But at least 1,000 Paiutes went to the hop fields in 1887. They picked for 1 cent per pound. They go to Sacramento, Chico, California. Here's this photograph's from the 20th century, but that news report on the left is from 1891. Here's a camp. So they would go for a stretch in the harvest season and live there for a while. You know, on one part of the property would be the white pickers. There'd be the Paiute pickers, and there'd be Chinese pickers, all there in the same fields. In the 1880s, 1890s, there's also Paiutes going south of Walker River to the Borax salt mine at Rhodes Salt Marsh, taking the train down there. Paiutes also worked at the rail stations, you know, unloading, loading freight. In Winnemucca, Nevada, they were paid $1 a day, according to Leslie's magazine. This is 1877, which is the same rate as the Chinese laborers. There's also folks who would bring their own products to the stations and sell their goods. This is common throughout the West. Here's a woman trying to sell something to the passengers. I'm starting to run out of time. I want to leave time for discussion. A few things, you know, the complications of these rail lines, bringing people closer together, but also, you know, helping destroy their ways of living. There's also instances like this one where you know, folks are tragically killed, where folks heading to Sacramento in this case, the train derails because they're not riding in a normal passenger car. They're riding on top of the boxed car or in the blind cars. They perish. There's also a lot of complaints about how much they're being paid, how much they're being charged to travel on the Truckee Railroad back to their homes. There's instances of a little bit of labor activism, you know, writing to people in charge, complaining to newspapers that they're not getting paid enough, complaining that they're being charged to ride the rails even though they're supposed to be riding for free. So on the Carson, Colorado Railroad, the rail line eventually stops allowing the Paiutes from riding for free. At least they let them ride for free, but they stopped allowing them to bring all their stuff with them, to bring the pine nuts, to bring their products with them. And so there's a lawsuit eventually, and it's not until the late 1980s where this is sorted out, and the Walker River folks win. I can talk more about that if anybody has questions later on, but I'll stop there and let Sarah come up. Okay. I just messed it up.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kais. Ooh, looks good. I teach and research history at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I would just like to thank you for allowing me to come here today. I've been learning so much, and I'm just going to speak to you for just a short time. And basically what I'm going to do in a few minutes is just to start to initiate a conversation around 3 of the guiding questions that brought us together for this gathering. And I'm going to really start by focusing on the first. How did railroads, their corporate backers, and the government contribute to the dispossession of indigenous peoples? And then I'm going to turn to the second 2 questions. And I'm going to do this and initiate this conversation by talking first about settler colonial placemaking and mythology and its relation to railroad dispossession, because railroads were not only corporate companies and builders, they were also corporate history makers. So we see capitalist-sponsored histories being produced by the railroads. And then I'm going to talk about one example of a Native response, and I'm going to talk about the response from Sarah Winnemucca. Northern Nevada, Northern Paiute country. So I'm going to start, I see now how this works. And now you can see the slide I actually want you to be on. So I'm going to start with something that asks you to participate now. So what do you think might have been one of the key symbols of settler colonial possession in Native America? So if you were on the tour, you saw a symbol when we were on our bus. All of those letters that are on the hillsides around different white colonial settlements. Can we think of anything else? And if you can't think of anything, you can talk to people at your group. And then I'll come around and I'll get my mic up front. Sometimes on churches, what's a major religious symbol associated with churches? Oh, now you can hear me. Thank you. You're the best. We just met, but he's fantastic. Okay, so a symbol associated with churches. Yes, fantastic. Crosses. Census. Fences. Yes. We've had a lot of talk about census, too, and sound with the railroads. Yes. Don't want an echo. Crosses. Okay, so here's an example of a cross from the 19th century. This is in the East. This is a cross that is in Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's just outside Boston. It's the first white cemetery in Native America, in where we are, that is designated a rural cemetery. And whites use these as they expand across the West to claim land and space. Moving farther west, we have Independence Rock in Wyoming. This is an important settler colonial symbol along what I study, the Oregon-California trails, or the Overland Trail. We have, in 1842, government-funded explorer John Charles Fremont scrambling to the top of the rock, chiseling a cross, and then painting over it with rubber. Now, he talks about doing this, he writes about it, he celebrates it. Sorry for Fremont, not many other people do. But he's still doing the cross. And whites don't stop with the symbolism of the cross. You have Mount of the Holy Cross, located in Colorado. Becomes widely celebrated, in part celebrated because William Henry Jackson, who's a photographer, who also works for the railroad, takes a photograph of it. Too bad for Jackson, the snow's not all filled in, so he fixes the negative, right? This deliberate placemaking, this deliberate history making and symbolization of white settler colonial possession. Now, has anyone seen this cross? It is in the Great Basin. Okay, so this is the one I want to talk about. This is in northern Nevada. It's just outside Beowawe. It's on the railroad line. This white cross was probably first erected to this height in 1906, but beginning in 1875, guides to the railroad celebrate this cross. They direct those wealthy white tourists who are on the trains to look at this gravesite. They command them to bare their heads in reverence to this sacred space. This cross is designated the Maiden's Grave, which has particular symbolism for settler colonialists: white suffering, white tragedy, the tragic, vulnerable loss of a young maiden. Lucinda Duncan, you may be able to make out that name, is not, in fact, a maiden. I can tell you more about that in the Q&A. All right? Seriously, making up stories. There's a lot of these. Okay, so 1906, they get the first big white cross. When the Southern Pacific takes over in 1960, they re-erect a new one. So this is maintained deliberately down to the present. I took this photo a while back now, but it's still there. So that was our first guiding question. I want to turn to our second by telling you a little bit about Sarah Winnemucca and her description of her temporary grave on the California Trail. So Sarah wrote this story. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm not totally sure. Okay. So Sarah wrote this story of her temporary grave for a white audience. She may have given a speech describing what I'm going to relate to you, but what I'm going to relate to you comes from her 1883 book, Life Among the Paiutes. And she's doing something here that's really interesting with this story. So she's talking to a white audience, and she reads and speaks, writes English, and so this helps her to sort of craft this narrative. So here's what she says. She says that when she was a child, she was with her cousin, her mother, and her aunt, and they were along the Humboldt River on her people's land. They heard white immigrants were coming. They were terrified. They know these white immigrants on the California Trail are cannibals, so they know they have to hide. The mother and her aunt go to protect the children, and they hide them. And they hide them by covering their entire bodies up to their necks with the hot, stifling sand. And then they camouflage their faces by wringing them with fragrant sagebrush. They tell the girls to be quiet, and then they go to hide themselves. Sarah and her cousin were there all day, and they were terrified. They were scared to breathe lest they make a sound and be discovered. So their lungs were nearly stilled, while their hearts were pounding ever harder. At the end of the day, Sarah's mother and father unbury her, and it's almost, in her description, a type of resurrection. Now, as I said, Sarah wrote, and she may also have performed this story for a white audience. And in doing this, she told them a few things. And one of the things she was really doing here is she was building a bridge between herself and her white audience. She was describing herself as a terrified, vulnerable young girl to a white audience that would have been largely dominated by white female reformers from the Northeast, who themselves, fighting for suffrage, would have identified with that female vulnerability. Second, she described herself as temporarily buried alive. And this is done in the 1880s at a time period when white Americans are purchasing bells and pulleys to put inside their caskets in the event that one of their relatives is prematurely buried alive so that they might be able to save them. And then third, she's describing that Christian-like resurrection. So she builds this bridge of connection with her story. But she didn't want her audience to see her as like them. She wanted them to see something new. She wanted to tell them that U.S. expansion through the Overland Trail and then the railroad had not been a harbinger of peace and progress, that the violence of the West was not native but white, and that the land and what whites called Northern Nevada was a place for Native people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions and answers, or answers on this part, questions from your part. So we have a microphone here. Are you able to walk around for people who can't walk up to the stand?
Yeah, I can do that. We can also start with one from our virtual audience.
Okay.
It's already been sent in, if that
Go,
works.
yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, this is specifically for Mr. Zabarte, who I cannot see, but I'll just read it. This person is asking what environmental justice groups can do to help fight for the protection of the Yucca Mountain today. That's the question.
Yeah, so what's needed to protect the Great Basin that would be helpful to the Western Shoshone is for all federal projects using federal money to prove ownership, just as the Yucca Mountain site requirement of 10 CFR, I think it's 63.121 now, which requires the Department of Energy to prove ownership. But this would go to any other federal project, including interstate highways or other infrastructure projects, and there's a lot of money going out right now for those types of things, including solar. I'm an electrician by day, and I'm building solar sites, but I think it's important to for people to understand that our identity is the land, our identity is the water. I am water, and we know what we're trying to protect. Engineers and scientists, they can engineer anything. They're not connected like we are to the land. Scientists, they want to do pure science. I understand that. I get excited too when I think about the things that are happening, but we know what we're trying to protect, and it's that water and it's that land. So being able to prove ownership before we do these projects would be helpful, and understanding better what the impact of the full scale of deployment of technology could have.
Other questions, please raise your hand. Sound really strict, sorry.
Thank you all for your presentations. Ian, what you began with, even the phrase where you said you went home and saw your people dying from the impacts of nuclear waste or radioactivity, that really hit me, because there's many peoples, indigenous peoples, who have similar stories. And what's shocking too that people don't realize is we don't even know what's killing us. Exactly what you said is that silent killer, and there's different reasons for those silences. That I thought my family just got cancer. I thought that's just how it was, that we all would get cancer eventually. So that trauma that you talk about and passion, it's very powerful. So thank you. I just think people have to recognize that. It's in a sentence, but it's deeper to real people, lives, family, relatives. My question is actually maybe to anyone on the panel, especially the group that it seemed there were coordination between three of you, and about how you're engaging with youth, because a number of you are involved in education in one way or another. And I think any of you could answer this question, because it is all about educating, bringing awareness, building these kind of connections, even the guiding questions that you had, and sharing these sources. I thought that was wonderful to conclude with Winnemucca's narrative here and story. But can you tell us a little more of how you actually engage, especially with youth or audiences? We often are in these academic circles and in universities where I guess we have, maybe I'm a professor too, so maybe you have some people who are ready, like in that mindset to maybe listen to these kind of formalized presentations, but then how do you connect to multiple audiences? And I think especially youth. And I'm not assuming that every student who enters college, for example, they're often young, and really figuring out their own identities, and it's really shocking what you're asking and bringing up to them, or anybody in general who you just meet. So I am interested in hearing about that from folks of experiences, insights in, because it sounds like you all would have, you're implying you have those experiences with this presentation. Thank you. Yeah.
Would someone like to take this?
I guess I'll start us off. I'm in the unique position of being in the museum world. And in Nevada, fourth graders are mostly required to visit a public educational facility like a museum. Nevada offers free admission to all its museums for everyone under 18. So not only do we get the students that come on field trips, we get students that come with their families that are visiting our institutions. So it's really important to us to take that educational mission very seriously. Now, how do we tie that to what we're here discussing today? I can't speak for other institutions, but I know every time I get a school tour, I do a land acknowledgement recognizing the fact that the area the museum is in currently was stolen from the Southern Paiute. I also talk about railroad colonialism specifically as part of the educational product of the tour, to understand that while railroads were viewed as this method of progress to Euro-Americans, the inverse was equally true, that they often facilitated dispossession of land, furthering of genocides, a means to acculturate individuals that were already forced onto reservations. So what was good for Euro-Americans was often to the detriment of Native Americans. And that has to be part of the story we're telling. We can't just have it be like most railroad museums where you go and it's, you know, manifest destiny at 110%. You know, that can't be the story we tell. And so that's how I'm trying to shape my museum, and I hope other railroad museums follow.
I teach largely undergraduate courses, mostly introductory courses where students aren't history majors. They come in and take a U.S. history course, and maybe it's the first course they've taken in U.S. history in quite a while, if ever before. And of course, their conception of American history might be much different than reality, right? And so, it's important to frame the narrative of any course I teach, and of course I also teach Native American history. Frame it, through the perspective of Native Americans. Make their story a part of that larger narrative. I think that among teachers across the country who have spent their lives dedicated to educating our youth and our young adults. I think that the direction should be using sources produced by Native Americans, using Native testimonies, using Native letters, presenting our history through that perspective.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and I think that as in so many things, there's a contradiction between being at a university and that you are at the university and you're in a particular type of environment, but then being there can also sometimes allow you to pull together resources or to mine those connections, to make those kinds of connections, and to hopefully make an impact that reaches beyond the boundaries of the university and goes into K-12. We're trying to do a lot of that in my department at the University of Nevada, Reno, UNR, and that's been really wonderful to see. We also work with a lot of double majors in both in education and in history, so they're training to be social studies teachers, educators, in the classroom. And I think it's always a struggle, but always a goal. I teach courses on the U.S. West and U.S. history, and I want my students, many of whom are from Nevada and the West, to be able to walk out of my class and say, I learned these things that I didn't know before, and I'm going to go forward and share them with others. So I hope to pass it on in that way as well.
And the other thing one thing that surprises students a lot, and it's hard to understand why this is a surprise, is when you talk about settler colonialism, the idea that the West was colonized, which is absolutely true, surprises a lot of students. They don't see that narrative of Western expansion in a negative light oftentimes, and so using the phrase colonialism, something that was an intentional, long, violent process is critical, I think.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Hi, this question is for Zabarte. My name is Maisel Sparel from High Country News. I did a recent story on the White Mesa uranium mill, and so I have somewhat of a familiarity of sort of nuclear waste and sort of the political processes and sort of the consequences from that of the indigenous communities in White Mesa. A question I have is that today, the Secretary of the Department of Energy today mentioned the importance of finding a national solution for disposing nuclear waste. Do you think, especially with the ongoing sort of broad uranium strategy, that's sort of been kind of been ongoing since Ukraine, and sort of like, oh, we need to devise a broad policy and strategy for uranium reserves, and sort of like the whole process of domestic the industry. The question I have is, because of these current events and discussions, how optimistic are you that this current administration would grant a treaty reservation?
How optimistic I am that this administration would grant a treaty reservation. Well, we have a couple of options. One, which is litigation against private property holders in Nevada. I mean, right now our situation is that for Yucca Mountain, for example, so much taxes are paid by the federal government to Nevada. We're being defrauded of our property interests. That is taxation without representation, and Nevada's getting those funds. That is violence against the Shoshone people. We need Americans to stand up and people in the administration to restrain acts that would violate the basic human rights of the Shoshone people. This goes to the intent by these coordinate agencies, the BLM, the Department of Energy, the United States Air Force, and now the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that are intent on inflicting conditions intended to bring about the destruction of the Shoshone people. And again, this emanates from the culture of secrecy that the Department of Energy created this systematic process and wrote it down, cultural triage, in 1990 in that book. So what we're actually looking at are deliberate acts by the United States to inflict those conditions upon the Shoshone. So it's really not a matter of optimism. It's a matter of doing the right thing. It's a matter of law enforcement. It's a matter of basic human rights and dignity. We don't have civilization if we don't care about people, okay? We're doing what we need to do. I understand the concerns in communities that have reactor communities. I've gone, I've visited, I've seen them. I understand what the nuclear waste problems are there. And we don't look at these commercial reactors the same way we look at other nuclear material. What we find, though, is that, when there's an accident, Chernobyl, Fukushima, oh, that's serious. These are ongoing catastrophes. And potentially every reactor is a catastrophe, as well as a target when we're in war. These things are dangerous. They need to be stopped. And that's why I work as an electrician, building solar, because I'm plugging in. I'm changing the world to something sustainable. I'm not waiting for anyone else to do it. I'm doing it. That's what I'm doing. And that's how I change the world. And I'm going to pursue these issues with the United States. They need to be addressed, and other Americans need to join with us and stand up, find the guts, stand on their dignity and responsibility as human beings. and their humanity.
I think those are really powerful words to end our session with. So let's give our panelists another round of applause.